Hey OT dudes and dudettes, in this episode of Your First OT Job, I'll be talking about exempt versus non-exempt employees. It is important to know the distinction and what you are classified as because your employer could be preventing you from getting overtime and breaks that you deserve. If you someday become an entrepreneur, supervisor, or manager, or director, or rehab, it's even more important to know this distinction because it can mean getting sued for improper classification. This series of videos is geared towards new grad students who just passed their boards and will be entering the occupational therapy job market. This series of videos are the ones that I wish I had watched when searching for an OT job as a new grad. My name is Jeff and I am an occupational therapist who works in acute rehab and acute care in the hospital. I make OT videos and have a website, OTDUDE.com, with free resources for students and new grads. You are not exempt from skipping this video, so let's get functional. First off, I am by no means an expert in this subject. Disclaimer. This video is for educational purposes only and is only intended to be a jumping off point for you if you feel like you need to conduct further research into this topic or pursue legal action with the lawyer. If you're like me, you may probably never have heard of non-exempt or exempt. You might have seen it pop up in your job offer or on your pay stub, but what does it really mean and why does it matter? One thing to keep in mind with your job offer is to pay attention to whether you're classified as exempt or non-exempt before you sign or click accept. The primary difference between exempt and non-exempt is the eligibility for overtime. Exempt, remember the X in exempt, like crossed out, means you generally get no overtime. They are usually the salaried employees. Non-exempt would be entitled to and are protected by law for overtime, breaks, and minimum wage laws. The Fair Labor Standards Act, or FLSA, under the federal law, requires that most employers pay non-exempt employees overtime and when they work extra hours. So most of you in general will be classified as non-exempt because you will be paid an hourly wage as an occupational therapist. So you clock in the beginning of your shift, you clock out for a break, don't get paid for a break usually, clock back in from break, go back to work for the rest of the afternoon, and finally clock out at the end of the day. This is usually an 8-hour shift if you're full-time, and potentially less if you're per diem and you get your hours cut. Now this is where things get tricky. Although federal law has requirements, individual states themselves may have additional requirements and laws. State law is generally more strict and specific than federal law. And going down this pattern, county or cities have even more stricter laws, such as in San Francisco, which may have set a minimum wage, for example, for employers to follow that takes precedence over, say, federal. So if you are a new grad traveler OT, it is especially important to pay attention to the laws of the state and county and city that you work for exempt versus non-exempt, overtime, minimum wage, and break time laws. How is overtime defined? Again, that usually depends on the state. Some states define overtime as working more than 8 hours a day. These states are Alaska, California, Colorado, and Nevada. In all the other states, overtime is based on hours worked in a week, such as over 40 hours. We talked about per diem in one of our prior videos. It's rare for per diem to get overtime based on the nature of how many hours they work, but you should know still the law because if you manage to work the overtime criteria, you should still be entitled to 1.5 times pay, or if you go super overtime, double pay. So you may be wondering, okay, if I'll be a non-exempt employee as a new grad, why should I care? The problem is sometimes employees get improperly labeled as exempt employees. This may be intentional or unintentional by the employer. In small businesses such as private practice and clinics, many employees often get labeled incorrectly as exempt because the owners may be new entrepreneurs and unfamiliar with the terminology. Some employers may do this on purpose so that they do not have to pay their employees overtime. Also, it can get confusing and is not simple black and white of how you get classified as exempt or non-exempt. Exempt is not just based on your job title such as manager alone. You go through a list of requirements before meeting the criteria for being exempt based on the state that you work in. Another important point, Just because you are salaried does not automatically make you exempt. You may have been wrongfully classified as exempt when you should be non-exempt. Exempt is usually reserved for administrative roles, or even some doctors may be exempt and get paid a salary, such as being on call and work less than, say, 40 hours in one week, but more than 40 hours in another week, but they average overall 40 hours. I'll go over an example for exempt. In California, where I work, to be classified as exempt, you must 1. Be primarily engaged in executive, administrative, or professional duties. 2. Regularly and customarily exercise discretion and independent judgment on the job. Not entirely sure what that means. 3. Earn a salary equivalent to at least twice the state minimum wage for full-time work. So according to my research, an employer cannot be fired or retaliated against for reporting violations related to exempt classification in labor laws. Firing an employee for questioning exempt or non-exempt status may amount to unlawful retaliation. The bottom line is, if you are non-exempt, you won't have to worry because you are protected under FLSA and entitled to overtime, breaks, and minimum wage laws. As new grads, pay special attention to when accepting your job offer, whether it is exempt or non-exempt. If you believe you are wrongfully classified as exempt, you could be entitled to unpaid wages and also other things such as unpaid overtime, breaks never provided, attorney costs, and again, I am not an attorney, but if you want to start doing some research, Google your state followed by exempt versus non-exempt laws.